welcome into the REVO Church podcast. I'm Jamie and I'm the host of the podcast, and welcome back. This is episode 2 of our podcast where we are talking about living bold. If you go to REVO Church, or if you've heard about us, maybe you saw one of our videos, you saw last week's episode, you clicked on our website and you scrolled into our core values, because if you're ever looking at a church and you're not going to see what they believe, you should be doing that. But in one of our core values is live bold, because here's what we believe. We believe that if you are a Christian, if you are a believer, if you love Jesus, that you should be living bold, that you should be going and sharing the gospel, telling people about Jesus. And I am joined by my esteemed co-host, my lovely bride, the apple of my eye. I could keep going, but man, I'm joined by my wife. This is Kasey. She is also not super shy with the camera. She has been on one other podcast, and more notably, she's the person that is usually consistently flipping the cameras and behind the scenes, making sure all the sets look good. She likes to be the hands and feet, but not the face of everything that's happening. She's the behind the scenes master, whipping everything up. I'm so glad you're on the podcast, girl. How you feeling?
I'm feeling great. Thanks for having me. I think definitely true. I like to be the hands and feet, but not the face. So this is kind of new for me.
Even though your face looks so good, that's how you do it, guys. But man, I'm so pumped that you're here, because what we're doing in this series is we're talking about living bold. We're talking about how we are meant to go into the world and share Jesus. And more specifically, we're talking about how, wherever you, the old phrasing is, where you live, work, eat, play, study, and shop, you should be the hands and feet of Jesus. You should be sharing the gospel. And so why don't you take a second and just tell us, because I know what you do, but why don't you just tell us, hey, what do you do for a living? What's God put on your heart to chase?
Yeah, so I am currently a PhD candidate.
Woo!
Woo! I'm still in school in the neuroscience program at Wake Forest University School of Medicine. And so I kind of have a unique position between the world of school and working. So I am technically still in school, but I also work in my PhD. So I do a lot of research where I study decision making and why people make the decisions they make, and how do we make those decisions, and then how can we change those decisions to be more healthy and to give us a better life. Yeah.
I love when you tell people about your job, because anytime someone asks what you do, you're like, oh, I'm a student. And they're like, oh, that's cool. And then you tell them what it is, and they're like, oh. They always make the same face of like, wow. And then you always follow that up with, but I'm not the smartest person. I just work really hard. But everyone already is like, oh. But I love it. So going in, you're in the very academic space. You have a lot of scientific minds, a lot of super brilliant people. Sometimes their heads are 10 feet above the nearest cloud.
Yeah.
And so you kind of have to bring them back down when you're asking them a question. But what does it look like with just religion in the space that you're working at?
Yeah, I think religion is really interesting in the space that I work at. Because I think you have two different kind of groups. You have the group that kind of wants nothing to do with it. They don't want to talk about it. They don't want to think about it. They definitely don't want to hear about it from you. But I'm finding more and more that even though I would say most of the people I work with are not very religious, they're very interested in it.
Okay.
All of their questions, all of their thoughts kind of center around it. And especially in this new field that I'm kind of working in, where we're looking at consciousness and decision making, they definitely always have these religious, spiritual questions, even if they don't kind of know it. So they'll even think that they are very far from religion. And yet I hear the questions that they're asking, and I know that they're actually religious, spiritual questions. So I think you kind of have two encampments in the science world.
Okay.
Of those who just want absolutely nothing to do with it.
Yeah.
And then those who, they might not be religious, but they're fascinated by religion and spirituality.
Yeah. So walk us through a little bit, because being your husband, I get to be in some of those conversations. I've had the blessing of, Wake Forest will do recruitment events where new students come in and they host a dinner. And so usually when they host the dinner, that's when I get to come and be like, thank you, Wake Forest, for the Cugino's pizza. But then I get to interact with some of your friends, some of your the people that are in the lab with you, I get to interact with their husbands or their wives, their spouses, and I get to meet them. So I get to interact a little bit. But tell me, like, what is the general last week John was on the podcast and he was talking about like the vibe.
Yeah.
And so I just like the phrasing of the vibe. What's the vibe when people find out that you're a Christian?
Yeah, I think it's always interesting because I think it depends on what they find out first. I'm in a unique spot that I'm a Christian, but I'm also a pastor's wife.
Yeah.
And so I think most of the time if they find out that I'm a Christian first, right, because I wear my cross necklace or because I say something about Jesus or whatever, they tend to be okay. They might get a little uncomfortable at first, but they tend to overall be okay. Sometimes you'll have those that seem very uncomfortable, but I would say overall, they're okay with the idea as long as at first, like, I keep it over there.
Okay.
Right? If I keep it within myself, they're okay with it.
Gotcha.
But if the first thing they find out is that I'm a pastor's wife, right? So there's one particular instance in my head where, everyone kind of knew I was a Christian except for a couple people. And they immediately asked, "What's your husband do?"
Oh, man.
And it was at one of those recruitment events, right? It was new students coming in, interviewing. And I told them, I was like, my husband's a pastor. I think immediately you could see how uncomfortable they were. And I think that was a unique spot for me because most of the time I kind of have this way, I have a unique formula I like to use to kind of introduce people to the idea. But in that instance, I didn't get to really use it. It's the first thing they found out. And so you could see how uncomfortable they were because they didn't know then they had all these preconceived notions and they didn't know how I was going to fit into that. And so I think it really depends. It's all situational. Sometimes people are really okay with it.
Yeah.
Sometimes they're slightly uncomfortable, but they're fine. And then sometimes they're very uncomfortable.
So talk a little bit. You said you have like this unique formula that you want people to.
Yeah.
Because I've been around you. You don't hide your faith.
No.
But talk a little bit about that unique formula because I think that's something that for you specifically, but I think also this might play a big role in just people at home, people watching this podcast that, they're not working in academia, but the places that they're working at it's a little bit different. Maybe it's more of a, they're not like super team Jesus. They're more like either on the outskirts or they're asking questions. They're far, they're unsure. Like, so tell us a little bit about what that looks like, what your process looks like.
Yeah. So my process is typically, I like to build a relationship first. Yeah. And exactly what you said, I'm not trying to hide my faith. I just first want to build that relationship with them. Because, people may disagree with this, but I do think people, at least that I work with, they have had experiences with Christians that have not been good.
Yeah.
And I very much acknowledge that with them. And there's also other people that they just have these ideas. They haven't had bad interactions with Christians, but they have these ideas that they've heard or they've seen on social media, and also acknowledge that. And so first I want to build that relationship with them. I want to let them know that, like, I love them and I care about them and I want them to love me, right? And then, and along the way, I'm not hiding my faith. I'm talking about Jesus. I'm talking about church. It just might not register in their head at first.
Yeah.
And then eventually they'll say, "Oh, what does your husband do? Like, we've never talked about that." And I'll be like, "Oh, he's a pastor."
Yeah.
And they're like, "Oh, so you're a pastor's wife." And then you can see this kind of like fight in their head.
It just doesn't match up.
But I love her so much. Like, we're such good friends. But I have these ideas that I've always had about Christians and pastors wives. And that's why I kind of like to build that relationship first. And again, I've had several people then tell me, like, looking back at the conversations, I'm always bringing up Jesus. I'm always bringing up church. So it makes so much sense. But I like to kind of wait and build that relationship because then they kind of see that all those ideas they might have had might not be true, right? That I can love them and everything, and those ideas, might not always be true.
Yeah, I think one of my favorite things, so for me, like I said, I get to experience some of that in the recruitments.
Yeah.
One of my favorite things is when they meet me.
Yeah.
Because I think there's a lot of, I even had this. I've shared about my story before on different podcasts and different things. Like, I've shared my story of, I told God, like, God, I'm not meant to be a pastor. Like,
Yeah.
I grew up and where, we grew up in the same place.
Yeah.
Where I grew up, every pastor was like over 65, had no hair, completely out of touch with everything. And I was like, that's not me. Like, that's not who I am. And so I always told God, like, God, I'm not going to be a pastor. Like,
Yeah.
I'll follow you, but I'm not going to be a pastor.
Yeah.
And then, well, here I am a pastor. But I think it's so funny because if I had these preconceived notions, they also have these preconceived notions. And so then they meet me, and I think their first interaction is like, what do I do with this guy?
Yeah.
What box do I put him in? And I think they do the same thing with you because they see Kasey, the researcher. They see Kasey, the science girl that's, doing this work, presenting posters. Side note, you win awards. You don't tell anybody that you win awards. You win awards. You do good in your field.
Yeah.
And then they also find out, wait, she's a Christian, and every Sunday she's at church, and she's serving in our student ministry, and she's serving with women's ministry, and she's doing all these different things, planning events, loving the church, loving the community. And then also she's researching, and it almost feels like you break their brain a little bit.
Yeah.
And I always find that so interesting. So tell us a little bit about what it looks like times that maybe you've shared your faith, or maybe it's been you didn't necessarily go up and be like, I want to tell you about Jesus, but I have the knowledge, right?
Yeah.
But I'd love for you to tell a little bit about maybe a time or two where you were able to actually tell someone about Jesus at your work, like how that actually went about, how that happened.
Yeah. You and John were talking about softballs, right? Easy things to talk about in the workplace. And I think that's where I like to start oftentimes, right? Because I serve in students, I'm here on Sundays. I serve in women's ministry. We lead a students R group. We lead an adult R group. I have a lot of easy opportunities for when they say, oh, what'd you do this weekend?
Yeah.
Right? I can then bring it up. And those are those softballs I like to start with because they're really easy. And early on, and like working and in science specifically, I found it really daunting, right? I'm a pretty reserved person. I'm a pretty quiet person. So I found it really daunting to then put myself out there on this ledge. And so I found it a lot easier to start with those softballs of when someone said, hey, what'd you do last night? I can be like, oh, well, we actually had our Bible study. And, or we had students, or, we were at church and we were talking about this. And so I always like to start with those big softballs because as a quiet, reserved person, it gives me a little confidence.
Yeah.
And then it's kind of grown into being intentional, right? When something is said at work, not being so passive in my brain and my speech that it just goes over my head, but actually being intentional with, they said this, right? They're talking about, oh, you have your proposal coming up. Are you anxious? Are you nervous? Yeah. And me saying like, yes, I am anxious, but I know God will give me, the strength I need and the peace I need, right? So having those intentional thoughts, I think is really helpful because then, it's not so direct of like, let me share Jesus with you, but it's more of showing them in my life how he works in my life and then how he can work in theirs. And so then it's also when they're telling me about something, offering that advice, offering that verse that's helped me to where then they'll actually start coming to you, right? I have this coworker that I love and they were going through a really hard situation and they're not Christian, they're not religious, but they're also not completely afraid of the idea. And so they came to me and they asked me if I could pray for them. And that was a moment that I could see those little intentional moments really paying off in that they're not a Christian, they're not religious, but they knew that they could come and ask for help.
Like they saw you as that person.
Yes.
That was one of the moments that was in my head of like, man, just the fact that they were seeing your life, the breadcrumbs that you were laying, and we're like, I want to, I'm going through this. I want to go to Kasey.
But that takes a lot of intentionality. And so I think that's the part that It's been the hardest, but also the
Mm,
easiest. It's easiest to show Jesus through your everyday life,
yeah.
but it's also the hardest because that means you can't live a passive life. And I find myself doing that a lot. I'll come home and tell you, like, man, I really messed up today. Like, I should have said something, or I
Mm,
should have done this, and I didn't.
yeah.
And it just takes that intentionality.
I think one thing, with the intentionality, like where we used to go, shout out Camp Mana, where we used to, grew up, worked
Yeah.
at,
Met.
and it's where I met my wife. I love Camp Mana down in Coolamy. There was a leader there, Kathy.
Yeah.
Her big saying was, be Jesus to somebody today.
Yeah.
With the idea, the mantra that you might be the only Jesus that somebody sees.
Hmm.
And so, like, hearing you talk about like that intentionality of like, I'm going to make sure that I'm showing Jesus.
Yeah.
I think that's really important because that's showing that you're really believing that for some of the people in your workspace, you might be the only time they experience a Christian.
Definitely.
Because you've told me about times where they've never actually met a Christian.
Yeah.
They just have heard about what Christians are against,
Yeah.
or they've only heard about they've only heard about a negative of a Christian. They've never actually met somebody. And so you're able to really, bridge that gap.
Hmm.
And so I'd love to, we're going to kind of wrap this one up. I would love to just ask, do you have any advice for people when it comes to being intentional like that? Like practices that you try to do, or things that, you didn't used to do that now you do because you found out they worked, like any kind of advice on that front?
Yeah. I think a couple pieces of advice I have is it's all about relationships.
Mm,
And as a person that is reserved, that's what I used to really struggle with. I was okay with just putting my head down
yeah.
and grinding and working and doing what I need to do. No one doubted that I was a hard worker.
Yeah.
No one doubted that I was going to put in the work. I was going to, do what I needed to do, and I was going to succeed, and I was going to help my lab succeed. But then that often took away from having conversations with people,
Mm,
getting invested in each other's lives. And so I think having that vulnerability to be willing to build that relationship with someone that they might not love that you're a Christian, but
yeah.
that's okay. And so being vulnerable and letting them into your life and you being invested in theirs. And this is not oh, I'm just doing this. It's an actual investment. Like, this is a person that God loves.
Wow.
And God wants you to invest in them so that they will become his child. And having that mind frame of like, he's giving me this amazing opportunity to love one of his creations
Yeah.
and to have that investment. And so I think realizing that those relationships will go a long way. And then from those relationships, intentionality.
Mm,
It's one of the hardest things you can do, but it will make your testimony and your witness one of the easiest.
yeah.
Is being intentional in every moment of when they say something, how are you going to respond? When they ask for help, how are you going to respond? And that means knowing your Bible.
Mm,
That means being in prayer. That means having a good Christian community that
yeah.
you can rely on, so then you can take that back to them, right? So your own spiritual life has to be full, so then you can offer that to these other people. And so I think really those relationships and that intentionality is the biggest thing you can do. And then also not having biases.
Yeah.
Because I feel like when I first went into science, I had this idea that everyone was going to hate me, right? I've been with you since I was, 18. You've been in ministry since I was 18.
Yeah.
So I've never been in science and not been in ministry. And so I had this idea that everyone was going to hate me and not want to be friends with me.
Yeah. It's the idea of what was the movie God's Not Dead?
Yeah.
Every single person is just going to be trying to knock me down and be
Yeah.
like, God's not real.
Yeah,
And so, like you said, just don't have that bias.
exactly. Like, realize that they're actually probably more open
Yeah.
than you might think. And it just takes intentionality in a relationship and investment.
Yeah, exactly. One thing that you hit on that is really cool, John mentioned it last week, talking about hard work.
Yeah,
I think that should be, if you're a Christian and you're watching this, like,
definitely.
you should be the hardest worker in the room,
Yeah,
because, the Bible talks about you're not working for man, you're working for God.
100%.
I think about, you were saying this and the story popped in my head of Joseph.
Yeah.
Joseph sold into slavery in Egypt, and what did he do? He could have sat on his laurels and been like, my brothers threw me in a pit and then sold me.
Yeah.
Instead, Joseph was the hardest worker,
Yeah.
to the point where he was put in charge of all of Potiphar's affairs.
Yeah.
Rich man, and he said, you know who I want to run everything, my money, my finances, my house, my everything? The slave man, Joseph.
Yeah.
And then Joseph, there's some, potential sin that he could have fell into. What'd he do? He ran.
Yeah.
He ends up getting thrown in jail. What'd he do in jail?
Yeah.
He worked hard. He's interpreting dreams. People are seeing that. They're seeing that he loves Jesus. And it's just a continued cycle, to the point where at the end of the story of Joseph is the leader. Like, he is number 2 under Pharaoh. He's able to practice and follow Jesus, all because he's working hard, all because he's just putting his head down and saying, I'm working because I know that I'm called to work for the Lord.
Definitely.
I'm called to do it. And so I think just hearing both you and John talk about that gets me a little fired up, because I mean, for me, like, am I working hard? Like, I'm a pastor, like I mentioned last week, like, most of the people I interact with are pro Jesus. Like, I'm working with mostly Christians. But am I working hard because I'm working for the Lord?
Yeah.
And then vice versa. If you're watching this podcast, like, are you working hard?
Yeah.
Because you are called to work hard for the Lord. I think that's such a big key. And then the other thing I really like that you mentioned is it's relationship heavy.
Yeah.
Whether you are introverted and shy and, human interaction's not your number one option, you're not usually going to jump into that. Or if you're like me and, you walk into a room and you just expect all eyes to be on you because you're going to be loud. And so I think no matter where you fall on that, I think just that priority of I'm going to build relationships.
Definitely. I definitely agree. I think, having that mindset of no one's going to outwork me, I think is really big. And I think that kind of comes a little bit easier to me than the relationship side. I'm pretty competitive, so no one's going to do better than I'm going to do. But then pairing that with that relationship of no one's going to love that person harder than I love that person either, right? If they need help, I want them to seek, me, because really they're seeking Jesus, because they've heard the things that I've said and they're seeking Jesus through that instead of seeking someone else, right?
Yeah.
It's also that hard work of I'm going to love them so much better than anyone else because Jesus has given that to me. I'm going to, pour that out onto them.
No, I think that's so good. I think that's exactly the key. One thing I like that you had mentioned is the idea of, like, you have to be filled before you're going and sharing.
Definitely.
We had a pastor friend, shout out Keith. If you happen to see this, you're planning a church down in Texas. But if you happen to stumble across this video, I want to give you credit. He would tell about how, man, we're just like in the thickest Alabama accent. He'd be like, we're just a tea pitcher. Yeah. And we're supposed to, you can't pour tea out if the tea's not filled. Yeah. He was like, the same with our spiritual life. If we're not filled, we can't pour. And I'm like, all right, we're a tea pitcher. I never thought I'd hear someone tell me that I'm just a tea pitcher, sweet tea. Love Keith, man. But that's so good. I hope that for people listening to this podcast, I hope that they hear that, well, the people that they think are so anti-Jesus and anti the gospel, I hope they're hearing firsthand from you that that's not what it's like. Yeah. Like, I experience that when I'm with you, but also just hearing you talk and seeing you, that's not how people are. They're not anti-Jesus. And so instead of coming in with they're going to hate me and I'm going to be this, it's instead, man, I'm going to go and love these people. Yeah. So I'm hoping for everyone watching that they see that and say, wow, like, I just need to go and break down some bias, go show some love, and then be the hands and feet of Jesus. Yeah. Taking it full circle. We're called to be the hands and feet of Jesus.
100%.
But I'm so glad that you jumped on the podcast, Case. I know you're not always the upfront person, but I think when you step in front, when you step in the limelight, I always think it's so beneficial. But I'm glad that you guys tuned in. This was episode 2, where we talked about living bold in the workplace. Join us next week as we continue the conversation. We'll see you then. Peace. Go Pack.
Go Pack.